Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we are going to explore the subject of working with life's challenges, which involves an examination of the nature of suffering, pain, and the role that this kind of experience has in our spiritual life. So to begin with, we are going to examine the origin of suffering. All the quotes that I'm providing here were taken from the writings of H.P. Blavatsky, one of the founders of the Theosophical Society. You can see a picture of her below the camera. So I'm giving the reference to the writing from which I took the quote at the bottom of each slide, in case you want to look at this more carefully later. So what is the origin of evil and sorrow? I have already given a lecture that is available on YouTube about the problem of evil. So tonight we are going to focus more on the nature of sorrow. But Blavatsky says the Pythagoreans, which were a group of Greek philosophers, pre-Socratic philosophers, hated the binary, meaning the duality. With them, it was the origin of differentiation, hence of contrasts, discord, or matter, the beginning of evil. So you see in the Theosophical view, as well as the view of the Pythagoreans, everything comes from a unity, from the one, what Pythagoras would call the monad, monas in Greek. And when we are in a state of unity, of course, there is harmony, there is no discord, because there are no separate different parts. But as soon as that unity polarizes itself into two opposites, then naturally we get a contrast between positive and negative, male and female, high and low, all the different opposites come as soon as the universe comes out of the state of unity. And they said, philosophically speaking, the beginning of duality is the beginning of suffering. And this is something important to keep in mind, because as we are going to see toward the end of this lecture, this is also the clue to go beyond this experience of suffering. So Blavatsky says, the seeds of evil and sorrow were indeed the earliest result and consequence of the heterogeneity of the manifested universe. So homogeneity is when everything is one, and then as soon as diversity appears, after the first polarization into a duality, then all the diversity that we see in the cosmos begins to develop. And this is what Blavatsky says, as soon as this process begins, the seeds of evil and sorrow are implicit there in that process of the unity, the homogeneous unity becoming a heterogeneous variety, diversity. Now, applying it to human nature, she says, evil denotes only the polarity of matter and spirit, a struggle for the life between the two manifested principles in space and time, which principles are one per se, inasmuch they are rooted in the absolute reality. So when we come to human beings, the nature of evil and sorrow, pain that comes, these are all related terms from a philosophical perspective. It comes from the struggle of these two essential principles that constitute us. In modern philosophy, there has been for decades a debate whether human beings are inherently good or inherently bad. And we can trace this debate actually to the beginnings of the Western culture. And generally there are two views. One view is that we are inherently good, but then as we grow up in the world and the needs appear and the conflict between the needs of different people, with all of this, we get corrupted and then we do evil things or wrong things. There is the other view that says the opposite. We are inherently evil. And remember, when we talk about evil in this context, is philosophically speaking, we are not referring to the devil or anything like that. We are talking about the source of wrong actions, from a small one to a big one. So the other view is we are inherently evil, but growing in a society that has certain rules helps us tame that natural selfishness. And then it is in this way that we come to be a person with good actions and also bad actions. The Theosophical tradition says that we are actually both. When we are born as a human being, there are these two principles, and from these two principles, spirit and matter, comes good and evil. Now, this does not mean necessarily that matter is evil. What we need to understand here is that the aim of matter and the aim of spirit during manifestation are opposite. All material aspect in ourselves is in a process of becoming more concrete, more dense, more separate, more solid, more differentiated. If we had a body that is not differentiated, that is just a blob of cells, that body would not be very effective. A perfect body is one in which all the different functions are clearly defined, separated. You see, for the body, differentiation is good. Now, for our spiritual consciousness, the spiritual consciousness is seeking the opposite. It's seeking to realize the original oneness. So it goes in the opposite direction, in the direction of more spiritual, subtler, more unitive. And it is in the clash of these two tendencies where good and evil, which are relative, are born. So this is symbolized in the Theosophical seal, where you see the two triangles, a triangle pointing downward, meaning the movement of matter into becoming more dense, as I was explaining, and then the triangle pointing up, which symbolizes the tendency of the spirit. And a human being is this entity in which the two forces are interlaced. It's not that one is on top of the other, they are interlaced, interrelated. So, continuing with this, comes then the question, what is the aim of having this interrelation of forces that are opposed to each other? And Blavatsky says that the result of this is the awakening of consciousness. She says, for example, suffering is the teacher, the awakener of consciousness. So we will see what she means. She says, no entity, whether angelic or human, can reach the state of nirvana or absolute purity except through eons of suffering and the knowledge of evil as well as of good, as otherwise the latter, good, remains incomprehensible. So the idea is that the spiritual entities that are evolving through the human kingdom, which is what we may call our souls, for example, in the Theosophical view, our souls is our true nature, and we in our true nature are spiritual entities, which in order to become pure, absolutely pure, as she says, to realize our oneness with everything else, and this is what is called nirvana, at least in the Theosophical tradition, the soul needs to experience suffering. And when she says through eons of suffering, she doesn't mean continued suffering through eons. Of course, we all know life is an alternation between suffering and happiness, sorrow and joy. But this repeated experience has to take place for eons until it can produce let's say, alchemical effect of purifying the soul, which is a divine entity, but purifying it to such a degree where that soul can realize the oneness with everything around. So that's one of the points. And then she says also that the soul needs to know evil as well as good. We can assume, okay, the soul needs to know what good is. But she says also it's necessary to know evil, to experience evil, again, philosophically speaking, as otherwise good would remain incomprehensible. If you see in the Bible, when you have the story of Adam and Eve, they ate from a tree, the fruit of a tree. That tree is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not the tree of good and evil, it's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it's not the tree of knowledge of evil. So they discovered evil and they were, expelled from Eden. It is the knowledge of good and evil. So this contrast, as we are going to see, between good and evil is essential because we cannot really understand one without the other. Everything is relative. Like a typical example is that a fish doesn't know what water is because all its life lives in water. So unless the fish has the experience of non-water, then it cannot recognize what water is. And our consciousness, that is a dualistic consciousness, needs the contrast to be able to realize within the relative world all the different qualities. We know heat because we know cold, and the opposite. Something that is unchanging, it's not perceivable by our dualistic consciousness. And for that very particular position in which our souls are, the position of being a spiritual entity, but it's a spiritual entity that is entangled with matter, is embodied in matter. She says we regard the incarnated ego, this is the word that she used for the soul, the word ego, the Greek word ego means I-ness, and the soul is a sense of the source of a sense of I-ness in us. So we regard the incarnated souls, let's say, as far superior, if not more divine, than any spiritual intelligence still awaiting incarnation. So there are many divine entities in the universe. We may call them angels, or different traditions have different names. There are different hierarchies. And Blavatsky says, we regard the souls that are going through this human experience in which the soul is embodied, incarnated. These souls are higher, she says, are superior to angels, to divine entities that have never had the experience of being entangled with matter. And she continues saying, the incarnated ego has odds against it which do not exist in the case of a pure divine essence unconnected with matter. So these souls, which is what we are, in getting entangled with matter, there is a cosmic challenge there for the souls, a challenge that is not present for those spiritual or divine entities that are not embodied in matter. So she says, those who have not gone through the experience of being incarnated have no personal merit. They are divine because their origin is divine, and there is nothing that is challenging that divinity. They have an intrinsic purity because they have never been exposed to the possibility of being tainted, let's say. So this is what she means that these entities have no personal merit, whereas the former, the incarnated soul, is on his way to final perfection through the trials of existence, of pain and suffering. So even though the incarnated souls right now have fallen into matter, and Blavatsky would say that this is the esoteric meaning of the idea of falling, the fall of the angels. Even though our souls are falling into matter, are entangled with suffering, evil, sin, let's call it, these souls are going through an experience that will lead them beyond the level of limitations and suffering and evil and good. It will lead them beyond all that to perfection, to absolute purity, as she was saying before. And this can be illustrated by the parable of the Prodigal Son. The story in the Gospels is that there is a household with two children, and then the older one decides they were living with the father in the house of the father, and at some point he decides to go into the world, to go to the city and to experience the life of a city. And there he had joys and sorrows, gains and losses. He had all this experience. And at some point he recognizes, due to the experience, he recognizes that being with the father at home is the right thing to do. So he comes back and the father greets him with a banquet. Now the other son that stayed with the father all the time was upset, and he asked, how come that I have been with you, I have never left you, and you have never prepared this banquet for me, and yet you are doing it for him who had left you and now is returning. And the allegory is pointing to this concept that now that the son had gone into the city, had the experience, and had come back, he has, because of the experience, he cannot be corrupted again. Let us suppose that going into the city symbolizes corruption, being falling into temptation, etc. He has a purity, the purity represented by being at home with the father, that now is incorruptible, because he already went through that, learned, realized the truth, and now the city is there, but it's not, cannot tempt him any longer. The other son that had never left the house of the father eventually will be tempted by the city. The purity of the other son is, as Blavatsky is saying here, is a purity that has no personal merit. It's a given purity, not an acquired purity. And that given purity is corruptible. So this is symbolizing what Blavatsky says here. Going into matter and being exposed to this period of suffering and struggle and conflict is actually, as we are going to see why, but this is actually what is necessary for evolution. And those souls who are in the middle of the struggle are, or those divine entities are more progressed, let's say, that all those divine entities that have not become entangled with matter and that may seem that they are far superior because they still live on realms of purity and joy. So let's see how suffering and sorrow and the difficulties can help in this process of spiritual evolution. Blavatsky says the final goal cannot be reached in any way but through life experiences, and the bulk of these consist in pain and suffering. It is only through this that we can learn. The Buddha also, when describing physical life, would say life is suffering or life is unsatisfactory. And when Western philosophers first began to look into the Buddha's teachings, almost unanimously they were cataloging his teachings on the branch of pessimism, saying, well, the philosophy of the Buddha is one of pessimism because it sees only suffering in life. Now, if we understand properly all these teachings, actually these teachings are quite optimistic, because sure, there are joys in life, there are moments of happiness, peace, inspiration, but there are 2 points that we have to keep in mind. First, all those experiences are impermanent. There will be joy and there will be sorrow. We have tried to avoid this, swinging from one state to the other for generations. Every generation thinks that they will be going to be able to be only happy, whether it is by acquiring more money, more objects, better relationships, more education, better health, and yet constant happiness is always elusive. The experience of pain, sorrow, loss is intrinsic in the human experience. Now, in our culture, we have the idea that suffering is out of place. We have this idea that happiness is what we should aspire to have, only happiness. And of course, as we will see, this is a possibility. The Buddha himself also talked about the possibility of going beyond suffering, but not as long as we are experiencing life in an embodied form, let's say. So this is one of the points. Sure, there is joy, but it's impermanent and it will be followed by sorrow. And this seems to be pessimistic. Now, there is another reason why many spiritual traditions say that life is basically suffering, because even the joys that we can attain during life, they are nothing compared to the bliss that is part of our true nature as a soul. All the joys that we fight so hard to gain during our incarnated life, if we could remember what the real bliss is, that is our true nature, when we leave behind the physical body with all the limitations and the difficulties, when this experience that we call life, but that from the point of view of the soul is death, we leave this experience behind after our body dies, and the soul feels that now the soul is reborn in its own plane, in its own home, in its own nature, then that bliss, the bliss of the existence of as a soul, makes seem the happiness and joy that we had during life, they seem also as suffering, as compared, to that bliss. So from a spiritual point of view, the physical life is a life of sorrow and happiness. Now, sorrow and suffering, with the happiness being a respite, but ultimately speaking, still nothing compared to the life in our true nature. Now, Blavatsky says it is only through this, through the experience of pain and suffering, that we can learn. And she elaborates, pleasure is fine, but pleasure is more, as I was saying, a respite. It is not when we have pleasure, that we are trying to seek our true nature, that we try to seek what is the best way to live. Most highly developed societies degenerate because once they establish a way of living that has a certain amount of pleasure, then they stagnate. They don't seek to look for something more real. Why would anybody seek for the real if the unreal is pleasant? So Blavatsky says it is only by experiencing the limitations, sorrow, loss, suffering, that the soul is forced to look into what is real, who we really are, what life really is about. So this is the existence of suffering is a built-in mechanism that ensures that souls will not get stagnated in the realm of illusion, that is the physical life, and will be motivated to seek for something that is beyond. Remember that even the happiest of the physical incarnations is nothing compared to an awareness of our true nature. So if the soul was able to generate a happy life with next to no suffering, that would still be something so far less than the souls can really experience, that is still a form of suffering. So by introducing this mechanism by which the very structure of physical life will produce suffering, because things are impermanent, they are always changing, or if they are not changing, we get bored of them, because something that gives a certain pleasure, at some point the body gets used to it and needs a higher level of stimulation because of loss. I mean, the way in which physical life is designed, it is inevitable that there will be an experience of pain and sorrow. So instead of trying to escape and to search for something that is just not possible, what is intelligent is to see what the meaning of this experience of suffering is and how we can use it so that we can awaken to a completely different way of existence in which we transcend the level or the realm of suffering. And this is precisely what the Theosophical teachings propose, as other spiritual teachings too. And this is why these traditions are actually optimistic, saying there is far more, and that far more is within our reach, and not pessimistic as some Western philosophers think. So then the idea of growth also, Blavatsky says, the very idea of growth involves the idea of disruption. You know, even physically, for our bodies to grow, there needs to be the destruction of the old structures. Now, destruction of structures necessarily have to produce pain, because if we wouldn't have any pain in our bodies, then we would not be aware when the body is being hurt, for example. So nature generates a kind of mechanism in which when a structure is destroyed, then there is the experience of pain. This awakens consciousness. This is a call of attention. You have your hand in the fire, take the hand off the fire. Now, that implies also that if there was no change, if the body was always the same and there was no wearing off of anything, then maybe we can see how there could be no pain in the body. But if we are going to introduce a dynamic aspect to the body so that the body can grow and develop and not stay just as a baby for the whole of the existence. Growth and development implies destruction of the substance. And that destruction of the substance implies pain. So this, typically we feel it when we are teenagers and our body is producing a rapid change, or in a baby when it's developing teeth, etc. Now, the same idea applies to our spiritual growth. Spiritual growth implies a change in, let's say, non-physical structures, whether we are talking about our astral or emotional body, our mental body, or the spiritual nature. And that change of structures also produce some kind of pain, not physical pain, but emotional pain, mental pain. At the spiritual level, there is no pain any longer, and we wouldn't talk about change of structure, rather than more like an unfolding of things that are latent there. So unless we wanted to stay stagnant for forever, for all eternity, there needs to be, or is inevitable that there will be some pain. There is psychological pain. Like a teenager again feels the loss of the child, the life that he or she had as a child, playing with dolls or doing this or that. There is a real psychological sorrow when there is a change, a form of growth. So this happens also in the process of spiritual evolution. So again, Blavatsky says the idea of growth involves the idea of disruption. The inner being must continually burst through its confining shell or encasement, and such a disruption must also be accompanied by pain, not physical, but mental and intellectual. And she continues, and this is how it is in the course of our lives. The trouble that comes upon us is always just the one we feel to be the hardest that could possibly happen. It is always the one thing we feel we cannot possibly bear. So psychologically, we have many limitations. And the inner self, the divine entity, is an entity that is unlimited. What is limited is our mind, our emotional nature, our physical nature. We as divine entities are always producing a kind of pressure on the physical body, the emotional and the mental bodies, so that they can express more and more of our true nature as divine entities. In the Theosophical view, physical evolution does not happen by means of random mutations and the selection of the environment. There is behind these processes that are true. There are mutations. There is a certain level of selection that the environment produces. But in the Theosophical view, the changes are pushed, are stimulated by consciousness. So this happens not only on the physical, as I said, but also on the emotional and mental nature. So because our bodies are limited, our inner self is trying to expand the field of activity of our personality, to break through mental and emotional barriers, mental and emotional prejudices, limitations, ignorance. And this activity of trying to break through produces a certain level of stress, sorrow, suffering, as we call it. Many times we may say that the suffering is because of what is happening outside. From the spiritual point of view, what happens outside is actually part of our own soul that is trying to get a situation or a message across, or an environment which forces us to confront our difficulties, our limitations. So because there is a law behind all this growth, Blavatsky says there is an order in all the experiences. And many times it happens that what we experience are those things that we feel are incapable of facing, where we feel we are weak, ill-prepared. We may think, well, if anything else will happen to me, I can handle it. But this in particular is exactly what I cannot handle. And there is a reason for that, because there is this order in the way in which we grow that will precisely generate challenges in life, situations that are aiming at helping us to realize the blind spots or the weaknesses and to work on them. You see, if you are a sport person and there is a particular movement that or a particular skill that you don't have to play that sport, how do you develop that? Well, your coach will put you in the situation where you have to use that skill. If you don't understand what is going on, all of a sudden you see yourself being forced to act that skill that you don't have, and you could think, how unfair this is. I am so good at these other things. How come that, I'm forced to do this? That is exactly what I can't do. And this is unfair. The universe is picking on me. But because we understand, we say, obviously, the coach is training me exactly in that I don't know how to do. Well, the same happens with life. The challenges that come to us are connected to the things that we as divine entities want to develop, the areas in which we want to expand our skills, our understanding, our activity. So Blavatsky concludes, if we look at it from a wider point of view, we shall see that we are trying to burst through our shell at its one vulnerable point. So that's more or less what I was talking about, that idea that the areas that we lack, in which we are weak, in which there is a blind spot, those are the areas in which we as spiritual consciousness are trying to expand our field of activity. Now, this process, which involves suffering, as we have been seeing, is essential for us to produce also a kind of purification. So, for example, Blavatsky says the divine egos, remember our souls, in order to re-become the one essence from which we all come, have to purify themselves in the fire of suffering and individual experience. So also have the terrestrial personalities, our physical, emotional, and mental natures. So this personality has to do likewise if they would partake of the immortality of the higher egos. So there are two levels here. The soul has to go through this, and the persona that the soul is embodying also has to be purified by the life challenges, so that the persona may be merged with the soul in a sense. And this is quite complex if we go to the technical aspect of it, but let's say that the more our persona, the mind, emotion, and body, the more this persona is aligned with the nature of the soul, the more the soul can retain the experiences that this persona or goes through. But if our personality has aims and feelings and thoughts that are completely different from those of the soul, after the personality dies, there is very little that the soul can take from that experience, from the experience in that personality. So this is why Blavatsky says the personality also has to go through suffering and experience if it will be merged with the soul and thus become eternal along with the soul, which is always eternal. And then there was an article by a person, John Bridge, entitled The Alchemists, and he wrote the following. There is a necessity of alternate action upon natural bodies. They must be prospered and saddened in order to be made pliable and yielding, all of which must be done with one fire. No, this is very alchemical language, but he says all bodies need to have an experience of this alternate action between prosperity and lack, between joy and sorrow, because by this alternate experience of one or the other of the opposites, then the bodies are made pliable and yielding. So Blavatsky comments on this. This is why I bring it up. And she says, man rises to glory through suffering in order to be made pliable and yielding, or impervious to the emotions and feelings of his physical senses. You see, one of the problems that the soul has when it incarnates in the body is that it finds this new experience that is the feelings, the emotions. These are not things that really belong to the soul. The soul, in its own nature, is in a state of peace, omniscience, bliss. It is only when it comes and embodies a personality that all these physical sensations and feelings and emotions and these different thoughts, the soul begins to experience all that. And the soul gets blinded by all these sensations. Now, it is necessary for the soul, as we saw, to go through the embodied experience. We can't go too much into the details of why this is necessary, what happens. I wrote a book, Evolution of the Higher Consciousness, where I examine in more detail what is necessary for the evolution of the soul and how all these experiences are necessary. But that is a complex subject. But the point is that the soul needs to have an embodied experience, and when it does, it gets blinded by matter. So how does the soul overcome that problem of being blinded? By repeated experiences. You know, it happens to us when we are exposed to a new situation. It may be overwhelming. But if we are repeatedly exposed to that situation, then we start getting our bearings in that situation. We know what to expect. We begin to understand the situation. We develop the abilities needed to develop to face the situation. And eventually, we feel comfortable in that situation. So the same happens with the soul. When the soul, through repeated experiences of pain and happiness and sorrow and joy, by this repeated experience, the soul learns about the nature of the physical, emotional, and mental nature. It develops the skills to express itself through these levels without being overcome by the qualities of the physical, emotional, and mental matter, let's say. By all of this, the soul unfolds its divine nature that was always there but was latent. And this Blavatsky says that this being pliable and yielding by this alternation of activities is an allegorical way of talking about gaining that equanimity where emotions and feelings and sensations cannot throw the soul out of balance. And then she says the fire that is feeding into this alternating experience, in the alchemical allegory, you have a vessel that has a substance inside. You put a lid on the vessel, and then you turn on the fire. So the fire starts generating heat and pressure, and that heat and pressure is what produces a transmutation in the substance there. So Blavatsky says that fire is alaya, the world soul, the universal soul. If we are going to personalize this, we can say that this is the deity. And the essence of alaya is love. All this suffering, and along with the happiness and the joy and the sorrow, all this experience comes from love, because the purpose of all of this is to help the souls to realize their divine nature and to actualize all that the souls have latent as a potency. And after the process of going through human evolution, the souls become fully fledged gods, let's say, with a clear awareness, a clear knowledge, a clear experience, and well-developed powers to become a builder of a cosmos. And this, again, is a subject we cannot go into, but this is how gods, builder gods, are forged in the experience of matter, of being embodied in matter. And there is in poetical language, we see this in The Voice of the Silence, a book written by Blavatsky. The Voice of the Silence, although she says that she translated it, this was a text that her teachers had. The voice says, "The tears that water the parched soil of pain and sorrow bring forth the fruits of karmic retribution. Out of the furnace of man's life and its black smoke, winged flames arise, flames purified, that soaring onward weave in the end the glorified three vestures of the path." So the last reference, the glorified three vestures of the path, is making reference to the three kayas or bodies of an enlightened Buddha. Let's say, this means enlightenment and liberation. So what is interesting here is that the Voice of the Silence says, life many times seems like a furnace from which black smoke comes. Sometimes we look at the world and there seems to be so much suffering, evil actions, ignorance, prejudice. This seems like a furnace from which black smoke is coming. And that tends to make us afraid. What is going to happen with us? Where are we going? This is going to end in disaster. The Theosophical view says this is part of the divine process. And out of that black smoke, that is all we can see, come these winged flames, purified, pure flames that soar into perfection. So although part of the evolution is to always try to follow the good, encourage the good, help the world to go in the direction of the good, we need to understand that what we may call evil, sorrow, is also working for the good. And be confident that out of this experience, there is only one result, and that result is good. Evil is just a temporary confusion. Evil is not, in the Theosophical view, evil is not a principle in itself. Evil is just due to ignorance, confusion. Therefore, it can never, in the long run, it can never last. The very nature of evil is, as I was saying, is built into the nature of evil that will produce good. Because evil is always tied to suffering. Suffering awakens consciousness and makes consciousness search for something that is truer. If ignorance and evil would produce permanent pleasure, then yes, there would be the danger of being stuck there. But that is not the case. So sooner or later, evil results in goodness. So let us finish with, is there a possibility to rise above suffering? Is there an end to suffering? Blavatsky says, we maintain that all pain and suffering are results of want of harmony, and that the one terrible and only cause of the disturbance of harmony is selfishness in some form or another. So she says, the natural state of the cosmos, let's say, is harmony. When selfishness is introduced, that harmony is broken. And selfishness, in whatever form or expression, is the source of suffering and sorrow. This is part of that mechanism that I was talking about. The soul, in order to be able to evolve, needs to develop a sense of I-ness. Now, that sense of I-ness at the beginning of evolution, when the soul is confused with matter, that sense of I-ness develops what we call selfishness, the sense of I am this body and not all those other bodies. I am these emotions, I am this mind, and therefore I want things for this fragment of the whole. That very act of identifying ourselves with a part instead of realizing that we are the whole, in that very fact is the seed of suffering. That suffering, little by little, will help us realize that we are not a fragment, that we are the whole. So there will be, as long as we act from this false idea of separation, there will be suffering. But that suffering will correct that false idea of separation. So there is this cycle that has an educational aim. As we stop considering ourselves as separate, as we realize the unity behind our existence, then we produce less and less suffering because less suffering is necessary. When we transcend selfishness, we transcend sorrow, and we transcend sorrow because sorrow is not necessary any longer, because we are not confused any longer. So you see, these two things are intrinsically connected. So she says, individual or personal existence is the cause of pains and sorrows. Collective and impersonal life, eternal, is full of divine bliss and joy forever, with neither causes nor effects to darken its light. One problem we have is that we don't know what it means, collective and impersonal life eternal. It doesn't mean the absence of an individual center of consciousness. It means an experience in the context of the totality. An allegory that is easy to understand is if we are part of an orchestra and we have our own instrument. When we play in an orchestra, we are not thinking about playing my own song whenever I want. We are attuned with the whole orchestra, and we play not motivated by what I want to play, my whimsical desire to play whatever comes to my mind. I play what is part of the plan of the orchestra, and we all together generate beautiful music, and we feel elevated, and we are happy to be part of this wholeness, and there is a blissful experience. It's a collective experience that is felt individually by each participant of the orchestra, but it's in the collective experience that there is the bliss. If any one of them at any point begins to play their own songs, then we have a chaos in the orchestra, which is what is happening basically in the world. We think we don't understand that we are a collective. We don't understand that real happiness lies in that collective experience. And because we emphasize the individual, it's like being in an orchestra where every person is playing whatever they want, and the result of that is chaos and disharmony, etc. So Blavatsky says, as the soul begins to realize its the unity that is the background of its existence, the soul has a lot of activities. The soul, as I briefly mentioned in Theosophical literature, the soul becomes part of a creative deity, let's say. But now all the activities of that soul is in the context of an awareness of the collective, an awareness of the totality. And it is in that impersonal, because it's not focused on my personal needs. For the soul at that point, all personal needs are transcended. In that impersonal experience, there is divine bliss and joy forever. So then she uses strong language with this when referring to this, because for her this is a very serious matter. She says, by suppressing, if not destroying selfishness, man succeeds in knowing himself as he is behind the veil of illusion. So, there is this selfishness. We can say, well, selfishness is necessary, or I like it, or I need it, and that is fine. But as long as we cling to self-serving points of view, self-serving actions, etc., we have to be ready to experience suffering. Suffering and joy, but alternating. There will be no room for joy without suffering. But by suppressing or destroying, by transcending, we can use different words, whatever is more appropriate for the way we speak right now. This was written at the end of the 19th century. But by getting rid of selfishness, we can know who we really are. And who we really are is that divine entity that is aware of the unity, that is an inseparable part of the unity. Then he will stand beyond all pain, all misery, and beyond all the wear and tear of change, which is the chief originator of pain. You see, the Buddha already said that suffering is because everything is impermanent. And we cling to things, and those things, everything that we can perceive through our senses, are impermanent. We may cling to our physical looks, they will be gone. We may cling to our health, it will be gone, or our strength. We can cling to a person we love, that relationship will end. We can cling to, fame, experiences. Everything will end at some point, either within our lifetime or when our bodies die. So Blavatsky says the being in the realm of change is a cause of pain. But if we can get rid of selfishness, then our consciousness is freed from a veil that makes us think I am this little fragment. When that veil is broken, is torn apart, then we see our true nature, which is one of divinity and unity. And then we can go beyond the realm of change. She continues, such a person will be physically of matter. Of course, there will be a physical body that still changes, still ages, etc. And yet he will live beyond it. His body will be subject to change, but he himself will be entirely without it and will experience everlasting life, even while in temporary bodies of short duration. When we as awareness realize our true nature, then even if we are embodied and we use the body to express ourselves on the physical realm, we are really beyond it. We understand this is a temporary tool we are using, and the things that happen to the body, we don't feel that happen to us. We understand, we know who we are beyond the body, so it is fine. Any tool we use at some point will stop being useful, and we get rid of it and get another tool, and we don't feel that our being is ending with the end of the previous tool. So when we realize our true nature, we understand that this body, emotions, and mind is just a vehicle, temporary vehicle I'm using, but we retain an awareness of us being the eternal nature behind this. So the changes at the level of the physical, emotional, and mental nature, realm, actions, those changes do not affect us any longer. All this may be achieved by the development of unselfish, universal love of humanity and the suppression of selfishness, which is the cause of all sin and consequently of all human sorrow. So this is a different quote from the previous one when she said something very similar. But the idea is that all this may be achieved by the development of unselfish, universal love of humanity. This is why in the Theosophical tradition there is so much emphasis on either brotherhood, unity, realizing that we are all, one, not only up there, in the origin of what we are, but also down here, and why there is so much emphasis on the idea of service, of helping other fragments of myself to realize the true nature, because we are all one self. And when this happens, then we can transcend the realm of sorrow and pain and live in eternal bliss. Thank you.